Hello, and welcome to the Food as Language podcast, a collection of stories told by people of color about foods that are important to them. Podcast guests will introduce themselves, talk about their identity, and tell stories about significant foods that they have eaten at home. This podcast centers the experiences of people of color, or POC, as the narrators of their own stories. In Western food media, POC are underrepresented. Their stories and their foods are often reported on by someone of a different culture. For the time being, this podcast will focus on POC voices and stories, although it may evolve in the future. A goal of this podcast is to increase awareness of POC foodways and to humanize their experience. The stories will show the significance of these foods and strengthen the connection between each food and its respective culture. The stories told through this podcast are from regular people and not necessarily chefs or food media professionals, although their personal stories may be included too. This podcast focuses on foods prepared at home to help them take up more space. Many foods are mainly eaten at home and are hard to find or rarely found at restaurants. Foods eaten at home also tend to be more personal. They're eaten more often and they have a special meaning. These stories will document foodways among POC so that we all know the inside stories of these foods and how they are experienced by someone as part of their culture and heritage, often passed down through ancestral practices. This podcast is partially a response to the often unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of foods and cultural foodways of one people or society by members of another and typically more dominant people or society, such as someone who works in food service, food media, food blogging, food photography, or other food related business. The stories featured on this podcast define the foods and social context for foods as experienced by people for whom those foods were significant. As the host, I will also explore the topics of foodways, cultural appropriation, and the social context and significance of foods. The transcripts from each episode are available on the website foodlovelanguage.com along with recipes for the foods mentioned. So, who am I? I'm Christina, a Cantonese Vietnamese American in my 30s. I'm from Houston, Texas, one of the most ethnically and racially diverse places in the world. My family on both sides is Cantonese from Vietnam. Cantonese was my first language, and I grew up hearing Vietnamese at home and at family gatherings since Viet was the primary language among my parents' generation. It's important to let you all know of my positionality because it shapes the lens with which I see and experience the world. Like many immigrant families, my family communicated their love and care primarily through food, which became its own language. My existence in the United States has been shaped by two very strong and often opposite cultures, and I am constantly reminded of my racialized identity in my daily interactions. Food has become a huge part of my experience with my family's culture. As a person of the diaspora, I cook my family's food to figuratively return home, or fanche, to feed my soul and to remind myself of where I came from. Food is culture, and for many people in the diaspora living outside of their mother country, it's a connection and a reminder of identity. My background has been in public health nutrition, and I will use my skills and knowledge to discuss health claims that are relevant to the topics and audience of this podcast that are often confusing. I am not a sociologist or anthropologist, so as I learn, the podcast and website will also evolve. I also love trying different cuisines as a way to see into someone else's world. This podcast is partially inspired by an experience I had making enchiladas potosinas with friends from San Luis Potosi, Mexico in college, and how that was the only time I'd seen that dish. With this podcast, I hope you'll get to hear some stories and experience dishes you wouldn't have otherwise. With each episode, you're invited into the kitchen of many people's homes to learn about how they use food as language.